Pio, you are late. Where were you?
After you blew up the planet with a virus bomb at the end of the last video, I flew off into space and past Mars. I had to hitchhike my way back here. I traveled on the ship of Dark Eldar pirates. I didn't know so many kings could exist.
Well, at least you got out of the basement for a bit. Now, I invited Inquisitor Eisenflork here again for the events that will take place in this video. Where is Inquisitor Eisenflork? Hey! Hey! That's my Flork, Inquisitor! Hey! Fucking bloody magpies. Joy, the Blood Ravens have stolen Inquisitor Eisenflork. Go and recover him. Yes, you can call your cousin for help. And remember, we need him back, no matter the cost.
If Joey has a cousin, I wonder what he looks like.
If they come back before the video ends, I'll introduce him to you, Pio. Now, let's continue the story of the Badab War. The warders of the Maelstrom had grown increasingly isolated and insular over the preceding centuries, losing sight of where their true duty lay. They had sown the seeds of their own calamity.
So, where were we?
The Maelstrom stronger than ever before, tensions with the Imperium rising, Huron taciturn and withdrawn when he came back from the Crusade of Wrath in the Maelstrom.
Ah yes, the Space IRS was angry. Let me put back on my helmet real quick. Ready now, I'm still on the side of Huron.
With all the events explained in the first part of this series, that I suggest all people go and watch before delving in this one to have a full understanding of the entire story we are presenting, the Imperium and the Warders have set in motion events that will lead to the second bloodiest civil war to happen in the Imperium after the Horus Heresy. The story continues in 901 and 41, with preliminary judgments into the Badab Schism in the Segmentum Courts Temporal weighing in favor of the Administratum. The Cartans and their allies within the Administratum decided that it was their chance to act. In 901 and 41, an Imperial investigation fleet that was commanded by an Administratum Assayer General and that carried representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus Biologis in Vigila, the Lords of the Carthago Sector, and at least one independently operating Inquisitor was assembled and dispatched to Badab to demand the immediate delivery of the Badab Tide, commandeer the resources, and the Astral Clause chapter's gene seed requirements. The fleet was composed by several huge mass conveyors with expectation of an harvest of wealth, and spearheaded by a trinity of cruisers, a Colt Mechanicus Locus Caravel, and a score of lesser escort crafts. The Force, calculated to display the power and authority of the mission and carry a not-so-veiled threat into the heart of the Tyrant's domains, could be seen in retrospect as just a misjudged plan, but few could have foreseen what was to happen next. In circumstances that still cannot be fully confirmed or explained, the investigation fleet was fired on and destroyed in its entirety as it attempted to force its way through the Badab system's Ring of Steel in order to press its demands. No ship survived, and more than 20,000 servants of the Imperium were lost. Tide Fleet VX-542 this is your final warning. Decrease thruster burn and heave to the designated approach. You will be fired upon.
This investigation deputation carries the seals of the Adeptus Terra. It is you who will comply. Make obeisance and stand down your weapons immediately in the name of him on Terra.
Damn you, obey! I don't care if you are carrying Saint Leor's bones. No vessel enters the Ring of Steel without first submitting to inquiry and piloting. This is the Maelstrom Zone, not some safe haven quill pusher's enclave. Claim and counterclaim ensued in the aftermath as to how this tragic destruction had occurred, and Lufti Huron, delivering his own Dominion's report on the Badab matter directly to Segmentum authorities, was adamant that the fleet was fired upon and destroyed for refusing to submit to the just authority of the system's masters, and paid for their transgression with their lives as mandated by Imperial law. Outrage ensued for the incident in the Carthago sector, especially between the ruling elites of the sector against the barbarians of the Maelstrom Zone. Immediately, all trade links were abruptly severed between the two areas, or subjected to the harshest of scrutiny whenever possible. Cartan Sector Governor Tanit Koenig moved to heavily censor the Astral Clause chapter, along with calls for the arrest and trial of Huron for treachery against the Imperium, while the local agents of the Magos in Vigila petitioned their own distant masters for the Astral Clause punishment. With customary inertia for the Adeptus Terra, it did not yet deliberately intervene. There were violent wars and conflicts that took priority over their attention, compared to a local discord between neighboring regions. All they got was a tangle of claim and counterclaim between legitimate authorities, something that paled before the weight of suffering and bloodshed elsewhere. In addition, fundamentally, Huron was the lawful master of a realm permanently on a war footing, a bulwark against the alien and the claws of chaos. And on the most basic level, he had the right to defend those domains, and without hard evidence, it was impossible to prove that he had willfully committed premeditated homicide against the Imperium servants.
I mean, what did the Cartans expect? You enter a dangerous realm like the Maelstrom Zone without authorization and refusing to cooperate with the forces defending it. What did they think would happen?
No idea what they had in mind, Pio, but this is the normal arrogance of planetary administrators and governors. They think they are untouchable, until they aren't. The Cartan Imperial commanders, under pressure from the Segmentum authorities and frustrated by the destruction of the Tide fleet, took it upon themselves to send 2 further punitive expeditions over the next 3 years into the Maelstrom Zone, under the assumed auspices of Imperial authority. Both fleets were lost in unconfirmed circumstances, never even reaching the Badab system, and intervention by the Astral Clause and their allies was heavily suspected. Imperial shipping began to suffer increasing attacks and disappearances while traversing the Maelstrom Zone, even outside of the territory of the Badab sector and the Astral Clause. Reports by the Maelstrom patrol squadrons laid the blame on an increase in raider traffic and warp squalls in the area. But for every loss, the whispers blaming Huron and his followers grew even louder, both on the Administratum-controlled tight fortress world of Sagan, on the edge of the Maelstrom Zone, and across the border, in the Cartan sector. The increasingly desperate Cartan lords, unable to enact their will on the situation decisively, and near bankrupted by this stage by their liabilities, first sought to circumvent Badab itself with the aid of the Administratum forces on Sagan. In a combined operation, the two attempted to access the Lost Tides directly, their ships taking the far longer and more perilous routes to the Pale Stars via Chimera. While the Cartans increased the quota demands from any other Maelstrom Zone world, such as Viania, their grasp could reach in an attempt to make up the shortfall. By 903 and 41, the agents of the Cartan Imperial commanders began to systematically spread propaganda in both the Segmentum Assises and the Senatorum Imperialis, elucidating on the moral corruption, treachery, and vainglorious pride of the Tyrant of Badab to any that would listen. Meanwhile, the local administratum authorities further pressed the High Lords of Terra themselves to intervene directly to punish Huron and his wayward chapter for their affronts. The Maelstrom Warders, for their part, continued to arm themselves for war, and conducted sweeps of the Maelstrom Zone in force, while within the Badab sector itself, massive and feverish building programs were underway, further augmenting their defenses in preparation for war.
The Cartans really are playing with fire on this one.
They are trying to harass not 1, but 3 Space Marine chapters that live in a literal war zone into submission just to pay taxes, Pio. I don't think playing with fire even describes how stupid of an act that can be. In fact, I would like to know what you really think about it.
Why is everyone so fucking stupid?
I just think there were better ways to deal with the situation.
903 and 41. Huron's answer to the continuing threats to the control of his domain was to produce his infamous Articles of Just Secession. These documents, which were also signed and ratified by the chapter masters of the Lamenters and Mantis Warriors, who had been convinced by Huron of the justness of his cause and the injustice of the outsiders' demands, were designed to formally sever the Maelstrom Zone direct ties to his neighboring sectors. Copies of the articles were delivered to Segmentum authorities and the courts temporal in response to, in the written words of Huron,
Many and grievous insults, presumptions and denials of the Emperor-given rights and titles of the Adeptus Astartes by the false and wayward servants of the Administratum, the Carthan Lords, and their allies.
These documents further stated the signatories' refusal to hand over the tithes to local segmentum authorities, aid or defend any attempt to do so, or recognize the demands of the Carthan Lords. They did, however, affirm the Maelstrom Warders' vow to pursue the defense of the Imperium as their sole cause, stating that the Maelstrom Warders must be given a free hand to protect mankind, as they had sworn to the Emperor, and without the corrupt interference of those who claim to serve him, but seek instead their own glory and greed. In support of their cause, the document cited both the edict that founded the Maelstrom Warders and the ancient rights and titles of the Adeptus Astartes prerogative in their defense, precedents that both weighed heavily in their favor. The document also went on to call for a full investigation into the rulership of the Carthan sector, asserted the historic and lawful sovereignty of the Space Marine chapters involved from outside interference by the lower Adepta, and stated again their willingness to defend the Maelstrom Zone from any who would threaten it. At the same time, though, Imperial shipping passing through the Maelstrom Zone's outer region began to be attacked and lost in great numbers to unknown forces. Contact with several worlds still loyal to the Carthans, and the Administratum Officium Sagan within the inner zone ended with garbled communication warnings of attack and siege by Space Marine forces. The Carthans, outraged, threatened all-out war in response, but simply lacked the means to do so alone. Instead, they petitioned aid to mount an attack from both the Departmentum Unitorum and the Segmentum Naval Sub-Command at Risa, but were flatly refused and informed that the matter was an internal dispute in which they would not interfere. It is also worthy of note that although they pled their case before these powers and procurators of the Administratum, that they avoided, where possible, any inquisitorial involvement in the matter, no doubt fearing the consequences of doing so. The local Inquisition representatives, for their part, more than well enough occupied by other concerns, were content to close an eye on the situation, mindful that such squabbles, however bloody, were far from uncommon between Imperial commanders, particularly in border regions, and no damning or conclusive evidence of heresy or taint had yet been brought forward against either party.
And from when the Inquisition of all organizations needs evidence?
Please, elaborate.
They have people like Fyodor Karamazov serving in the Inquisition that will condemn you to death even if he finds you innocent of all charges for the crime of, and I quote, wasting his time. So from when the Inquisition needs evidence to do something?
Yeah, strange that they are sitting this one out, especially when taxation is involved. Anyway, met with denials from the powers that be, the Carthago sector itself began to mobilize for war, drafting increasingly large numbers of troops into its planetary defense regiments and establishing direct military ties and former alliance with the Administratum Questor of Sagan, who also suffered from the secession consequences and feared the growing power of the tyrant of Badab. Further to their goals, and by the personal decision of the satrap Tanit Koenig, they sent direct and open appeals to several Space Marine chapters with whom they had past dealings, to aid them in recovering the missing tides and safeguard their ships. Koenig's motivations in this were later determined under inquisitorial questioning to have been based on the realization that only Space Marines could truly hope to contest other Space Marines in open battle. Indeed, she may have simply hoped to achieve a short-term neutralization of the astral claws in the region, using conflict against a third party to distract them, so that the Carthans once again could ensure free access to the Maelstrom Zone. This level of monumental arrogance and folly will soon prove disastrous. And you know, Pio, who was the first chapter to respond to the Carthan cause?
I will throw a wild guess. The Black Templars?
No, they are done with the Badab war for the moment.
Finally, a video without them involved for any reason.
The first chapter to answer to the Carthan cause, and that already had a grudge against the Astral Claws and Luft Huron from the times of the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion, were the Firehawks, under Chapter Master Stybor Lazarek.
Ladies and gentlemen, the pettiest chapter master ever known to the Imperium of Men.
The Firehawks are a Space Marine chapter whose name has long been a byword for devastation and wrath. And their story in the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes is a shadowed one, and their final fate remains uncertain and darkly rumored to this present time. In their history they have seen great victories, bloody deeds, and terrible reversals, being one of only a very few chapters on record known to have survived the destruction of not one, but two separate homeworlds, and have been brought to the brink of extinction many times, only to arise again from the ashes. They were noted in several classified sources as belonging to the Curse founding, also known as the 21st founding of M35, like the Lamenters chapter, and they always claimed antecedents from the renowned Ultramarines Gensid. But certain defects and variations in the samples held in the archive of the Adeptus Terra speak against this claim, and the Lords of McCrag have never publicly acknowledged kinship. The Firehawks have always only broadly adhered to the Codex Astartes, and are also long been notably strict adherents of the cult Imperialis, believing in the Emperor's divinity and the divine right of humanity to dominate the stars. Despite their religious zeal and strength of purpose, a shadow has long hovered over the chapter, and allegations of excessive use of force by them against civilian populations have often been leveled. Considered by their allies unreliable because of sudden retreats when the advantage in battle has been lost, they are unpopular with their allies, to the point that their disregard for the fate of other forces they were fighting with side by side on different battlefields created a feud that lasted 3 centuries with the Iron Hands chapter, that ended only with the death of a Firehawks commander in single combat to settle the matter.
Iron Hands mentioned, now they're good on lore for the next 10 years minimum.
Their 2 fans will be very happy of this. At the direct request of the Cartan satrap, Tanit König, the Firehawks chapter of the Adeptus Astartes agreed to investigate the disappearance of Cartan shipping in the areas to the galactic south of the Golgothan Wastes, which bordered the northern reaches of the Maelstrom Zone. On a number of occasions in the past, the fleet-based Firehawks chapter had used the vast orbital dockyards of the Cartan capital world of Sidon Ultra for resupply. They had also been invited by the Cartans to enact judgment on wayward planets and minor alien threats within the sector. It was on this relationship that the Cartans relied upon for a favorable hearing. The nature of the Firehawks chapter was also renowned, as they were bellicose and volatile, and it is likely that this also figured in Koenig's reasoning in making a request to them directly. The Firehawks at that time were conducting search and destroy operations in the Golgothan Wastes, and the Firehawks chapter master, Stybor Lazarek, as likely for reasons of his own as other motivations, accepted to dispatch several ships into the northern Maelstrom Zone. One such vessel, the Red Harbinger, entered the Endymion cluster in 350-904 M41. The cluster is an expanse of ancient stars, several of which contain human colonies inhabited for many millennia, and that had long fallen under the stewardship of the Mantis Warriors chapter. Intercepted and surrounded in a gallen system, the Red Harbinger refused to stand down and be boarded by Mantis Warrior strike crafts. The Mantis Warriors, ever fierce and proud, and goaded by the Firehawks' refusal and threats, opened fire and crippled the lone cruiser. Thus, the full-scale conflict between Space Marine chapters that was to follow ignited with this single act. Boarding and capturing the Red Harbinger proved no easy affair, as the Firehawks were more than willing to die to defend their honor, and losses were heavy on both sides. Less than 20 Firehawks were captured alive, and none surrendered. But their struggles bought time for an astropathic message to be dispatched to their chapter, warning of their fate and who they had fought. Chapter Master Stybor Lazarek, upon learning of the taking of the Red Harbinger, decided to withdraw the Firehawks from all operations already underway, and ordered the entire chapter fleet of the Firehawks to make best speed under warp travel for the Maelstrom Zone. Matters swiftly escalated, and the arrival of a Firehawks battle group was met at Gallen by a task force of both Mantis Warriors and Astral Claws warships. After a tense standoff during which the captives were returned and both sides traded threats, the Firehawks withdrew to await for the arrival of their full forces, which had been dispersed across the wastes, and in particular their massive flagship, the Raptorus Rex, a pre-Imperial mobile star fortress of incredible power.
Like the phalanx of the Imperial Fists.
Not quite, but similar. Very few ships can stand their ground against a star fortress like the Raptorus Rex. Rendezvousing at Sagan, and aided by the Cartan fleet, the Firehawks launched a series of probing attack and reconnaissance missions towards the Badab sector and the Endymion cluster, but in doing so, did little more than stir up an hornet's nest. The Tyrant and his allies had been preparing for war for years. Their forces were battle-hardened and were entirely familiar with the territory over which they fought, and their plans were well laid. The Mantis warriors proved all but impossible to pin down, their ships appearing and disappearing in the asteroid formations and nebulae fields of the Endymion cluster seemingly at will, while any force directed towards Badab found an impenetrable array of defenses set against them. Using the Cartans to distract the forces of the Badab sector and screen them from possible counterattack, the weight of the Firehawks struck at the feudal agri-world of Iblis at the edge of the Endymion cluster, attacking civilian targets and burning great swathes of crops and land in order to bring the Mantis warriors to battle.
The Firehawks truly made the Geneva Convention into the Geneva Suggestion in this war, eh?
However, unfortunately for the Firehawks, this attack had been both anticipated and planned for by the secessionist forces, and their own strategy fell into place, as the Mantis warriors' guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run attacks pinned the Firehawks in place on Iblis, and even more importantly, drew their fleet away from Sagan, as a combined force of Astral Claws and Lamenters chapters descended upon the Sagan system. Sagan was, for all intents and purposes, considered the gateway to the Maelstrom Zone, with their attendant orbital fleet anchorage and astropathic relay. But they were caught utterly unprepared for such a direct and sudden assault. Sagan fell in a matter of days as his defenses, although extensive, were soon circumvented. Sagan's protectors were overwhelmed amid the great slaughter of his planetary defense forces and Cartan troops caught on the ground. With Sagan in the Tyrant's hands, the strategic situation had rapidly changed, and now the second most important world in the region after Badab was under the secessionist direct control, along with the tight fortress stockpile of arms, munitions, and supplies. The Firehawks and the Cartan forces were now stranded on operations within the Maelstrom Zone, and found themselves cut off from supply and behind enemy lines. Sustaining heavy losses, the Firehawks withdrew from the Iblis system, the savage firepower of the Raptorus Rex raking the planet's surface as a parting gift, and successfully punching the Firehawks a way out of an attempt to blockade them inside the system. The Star Fortress claimed the life of the Maelstrom Squadron's only Mars-class battlecruiser, the Sacred Tetrarch, a war vessel armed with a Nova cannon, probably the only weapon capable of destroying the Raptorus Rex, but the ship proved no match against the vast relic vessel. After these battles, the fighting died down somewhat as the secessionists consolidated their gains and the Cartans retreated in disarray, and the Firehawks, that were heavily outnumbered, were forced into a series of running battles and defensive actions in the Maelstrom Zone's fringes. This period of forced retreat lasted until 710, 904, and 41, when the Marines Errant chapter answered the call of the Firehawks for reinforcements. A star-spanning chapter of noble renown, the Marines Errant's own histories record them as one of the chapters created during the 23rd founding of the Adeptus Astartes, which many sources place in the latter part of M37. The 23rd founding is generally believed by Imperial scholars to have been one of a series of foundings around this period designed to repair the power and reach of the Imperium Space Marine forces, which had suffered considerable losses in the preceding millennia. With evidence brought by the Requiem Malescent of Saint Kibra, no fewer than 50 Space Marine chapters had been destroyed outright, turned renegade, or were declared as lost during this troubled period, which had seen calamities such as the horrors of the Reign of Blood of Gog Vandair, the Plague of Unbelief, the disastrous Curse founding, and the forces of chaos and the orcs rampaging almost unchecked along the Imperium's fringes. The Marines Errant are of Ultramarines' descendants, descending from the chapter of the Eagle Warriors, and are a fleet-based crusading chapter, similar to the Black Templars, and are renowned for the honor they won on various battlefields in the fringes of the Imperium, where they suffered almost their undoing in the pursuit of glory and the cleansing of the alien, the witch and the heretic in the fires of battle. Answering the calls for reinforcements of the Firehawks, the Marines Errant diverted a sizable force of 6 companies and a fleet of support vessels from their preparations to undertake an extragalactic crusade, in order to aid their brothers Astartes, although their precise motivations in doing so remain unknown. Unfortunately, their arrival coincided with a renewed offensive by the Secessionists, and the Starfaring chapter quickly became bogged down protecting Imperial shipping traversing the dangerous long routes of the Pale Stars region and the Maelstrom Zone's outlying colonies. For the next several standard months, there were numerous repeated minor clashes between the two sides, the Firehawks attempting to mass their remaining strength in the hopes of forcing a decisive engagement, while the Marines errant, that had a better grasp of the reality of the situation, were splitting their highly mobile strike cruiser-based forces to guard convoys in transit from increasingly frequent raids and harassment attacks. The Marines errant found themselves caught between the desire of the Firehawks to attack and destroy Huron and his allies at any cost, and the immediate growing need to protect Imperial shipping and outlying colonies in the Carthago sector from attack by marauding secessionist forces. This conflict of interest was further complicated by the ancient ties of loyalty and blood that the Marines errant had formed with the Lamenters chapter, beside which they have fought as recently as the Corinth Crusade, but that now face as enemies in battle. This led to incidents where the Marines errant failed to try to do more than drive off the Lamenters' forces during raids, and in which both parties gave quarter and respite to the other, raising the mutual ire of their allies.
At least both parties recognize that they are killing other loyalists on the battlefield.
What sane person will want to fight the Lamenters ever, Pio? Accursed or not, they are some of the most noble and kind space marines of the galaxy.
I know, that's why they are my boys!
By the end of the year, an ever greater number of star systems were drawn into the rapidly escalating war. For all the Firehawks and Cartan losses, and the defense they mounted on various worlds like Surngrad, even with the help of the Marines errant, a dozen other worlds fell to secessionist control, leaving only the most dangerous areas of the Maelstrom zone outside the secessionist grip. But worse developments for the Cartans and their allies will soon unfold, as in 915-904-M41, news reached the Marines errant that in payment of an ancient blood oath given to the Astral Clause, the Executioners chapter of the Space Marines had also announced their armed support for the secessionist side, sending the warship Nightag containing a full augmented battle company of Space Marines to back up their worlds. The Executioners are an ancient and proud chapter whose origin can be found in the chaotic centuries that followed the Horus Heresy. The Executioners are scions of the proud line of the Imperial Fists, and were founded under the command of Fanfir Ran, reputedly the most vicious of Rogal Dorn's later captains. They were created, according to their chronicles, for the sole task of seeking out and slaughtering mankind's foes, rather than undertaking any more defensive or strategic purpose. The Executioners are a bellicose and almost barbarous chapter that disdains the martial trapping and ordered obedience imposed by the Codex Astartes on them and their forebearers, the Imperial Fists. But they have gained a fearsome reputation for sheer undaunted endurance and destructive wrath.
But why are they aiding the secessionist side? They are loyalists, why would they side with Huron?
You see, Pio, in the closing decades of the 39th millennium, in what is now a forgotten episode of Imperial history, the southern fringes of Imperial territory, where the fortress monastery of the Executioners is located, was assailed by wave after wave of orc nomad fleets, xenophore migrations, and strange psychic phenomenon, which themselves caused a near epidemic of witch cults, alien infestations, and demonic incursions. During the constant warfare to defend the Imperium border against all these threats, the Executioners had been reduced to less than 300 battle brothers when their own twin chapter worlds of Stygia Aquilon came under siege. The attackers were a nightmarish xenospecies of worm-ridden, writhing charnel feasters never before encountered.
It is most probably the Sloth, we mentioned them in the past.
Again and again they assaulted the worlds of the Executioners, until they managed to invade the inside of their fortress monastery of Darkenbolt. The resulting battles in the catacombs at the heart of the Executioner Fortress Monastery were unceasing and terrible, and in a short span of time, few Space Marines remained to defend the inner sanctum, and the chapter stood on the brink of extinction. It was the Astral Clause that saved them. Supported by the cruisers of Battlefleet Tempestus, they managed to break the siege of Darkenvolt, just in time as the Executioners were gathering for a final stand. Many Astral Claws died in breaking the siege, and among their losses there was counted even their chapter master at the time, Akas Seneca, still not mentioned in the notable members of the Lexicanum page on the Astral Clause. The handful of Executioners that survived owed a blood debt to the Astral Clause for the salvation of their chapter, and swore that should the Astral Clause ever be so threatened, they would respond in kind. It would take a century and a half before the Executioners returned again to full strength as a chapter, and they will never forget their oath. When the Badab War erupted more than 1,000 years later, they would heed Luft Huron call.
Outside thunder, fit to sunder the heavens, clashed in the turbulent silver and lead skies of Aquilon, lightning flashing a savage purple-white between the roar. The High Chaplain's iron-shod boots hammered rhythmically on the granite floor, his bone-sewn long coat clattering in the wind that streamed down through vaulted windows as high as Scout Titans. He barely heard the thunder and cared nothing for the storm. Thulsa Cain, High Morturge and Lord Speaker of the Dead, had other, darker thoughts to occupy his mind. Cain found Chapter Master Arkash Hakon waiting for him in the wide open circle of the Julian Vault. The commander of the Executionist chapter stood alone waiting for him in the flickering torchlight, his armor battered and scored by a myriad of battles dimly reflecting the firelight. The High Chaplain gazed on his master approvingly. It was their way to leave the marks of those they fought upon them, each one a foe bested, each one a war remembered. The scars his master, the Lord Executioner, bore were many, both on his armor and on his grim visage. All mementos of battles won in the God Emperor's service, of monsters slain and heads taken, and yet here was Cain, trusted servant, come to deliver him to an enemy no force or skill alone could defeat. Without preamble, Cain dashed a bundle of blue silk angrily to the flagstones between them, spilling its contents out for them both to see. The shattered remnants of a fine power sword clattered to the ground. It had been finely wrought with chases of platinum and gold, its pommel a snarling leonine head, and its hilt a deep, lustrous sapphire. "It is done then. The rumors were true. The tyrant has set himself against them all?" Hakon asked. "Aye, and taken the other warders with him," Ken replied with a snarl. "The warp runner put into dock at the Darken Vault 8 standard hours ago, and the simpering lapdog he set aboard delivered me this. Your decision?" "To side with one is to break faith with the other. But an oath is an oath. Throne or savior, blood calls out for blood. We honor our debts regardless," Hakon stated gravely. "Though it is perhaps our doom, we are the headsmen of Haemon Terra, sons of Dawn, born of battle and death. His executioners. What care we of doom or fate? We must send aid to the tyrant immediately. Blood will have blood, and the maelstrom will be awash with it ere long. Vanirex makes ready even now with his brethren, and the night hag is eager to sleep at dock and find prey. He awaits only your command," Cain said. Hakon chuckled darkly. It was not a pleasant sound. "You knew my answer already, old monster." "I taught you well," Ken replied. "Well enough to know that I must bear this sin myself. I shall make the journey into the outer dark to offer the Emperor the coin of my life to pay for our coming transgression. Let it all be done in my name. Gather our axes and take the chapter to Badab, Thulsa Cain, my Morturge, and let there be no new Lord Executioner till our blood oath is discharged. No master to be marked with its sin but me." Cain knelt before his master and received into his hands the massive black-bladed power axe, Life Taker, that was the sign and mark of the chapter master's office. "If it is to be an ending, make it such an ending that the scream of our enemies echo as far as the throne itself," Hakon whispered, and walked out into the storm. Thulsa Cain's half-dead face twisted into something resembling a smile.
As the Night Hag moved towards the Badab war zone, the rest of this notoriously grim and independent chapter's forces were known to be assembling on their distant homeworlds of Stygia and Aquilon, in preparation for war. The Loyalist forces were growing increasingly desperate, and with their own ties and supplications to the Procurator Generals of the Segmentum and the Adeptus Terra, Satrap Tanit König was forced to take drastic action. With the fleet anchorage at Sagan now in the hands of the secessionist forces, the Cartan Imperial commanders, near bankrupted by their sector's losses in the war, mounted a final attempt to harvest the resources they knew to be waiting in the Tides deposit of Vinia and Chimera, before the secessionists could consolidate their control of the western Maelstrom zone and claim them as their own. An hastily assembled armed convoy was formed around the vast Chartist highliner Cardinal Urdaneta, in order to carry out this last-ditch effort on behalf of the Cartans and their allies. Convoy Urdaneta was comprised of some 20 other armed freighters and mass conveyors, and was protected by the Gothic-class cruiser Dreadchild of Battlefleet Carthago, Marines errant strike group Mercurio, and 16 smaller escorts of various classes. It was the last gasp of Cartan's force projection into the Maelstrom zone. The secessionist intelligence network, however, had already acquired every detail of the supposedly secret mission, and they waited until after the convoy had glutted itself on wealth before attacking the fleet mid-transit into the warp. Ambushed by a secessionist attack group comprising the main elements from both Astral Claws and Lamenters fleets, and led by Huron himself, the convoy was first encircled, and then taken one vessel at a time in a series of ferocious ship-to-ship boarding actions. Both the Cardinal Urdaneta and the Dreadchild, as well as 23 other vessels, were taken as captive prizes for almost no losses sustained by the attacking force's ships. Only the Marines errant strike cruiser Starjackal escaped the Tyrant's trap, fighting its way clear with heavy damage. The taking of Convoy Urdaneta was a crushing secessionist victory that effectively ended the Cartans' active involvement in the war.
So, first they're arrogant, then they cause a war with their repeated offenses, and then they get their asses kicked so hard they pretty much surrender and just move away from the conflict.
Exactly, and all of this because Huron didn't want to pay taxes.
Based. The Cartans deserved it.
With the continued victories of the secessionist side, all they had to do now was to drive off the Space Marine forces who still contested them the Maelstrom Zone and consolidate their gains. The Astral Claws focused their attention on the Firehawks and fought them back to the edge of the Golgothan Wastes, inflicting further serious casualties on the chapter, which could no longer be considered an effective fighting force, while seemingly, or to better say it, strangely, sustaining no loss in strength themselves, despite the Firehawks making them pay bloodily for each victory. But the greatest reversal for the Secession's enemies came when the Mantis warriors successfully drew a sizable portion of the remaining Marines errant chapter into battle, on the industrial moon of Bellerophon's Fall. The Fall, as it was known, was a vital supply and navigation point, and was particularly bitterly contested. The Marines errant matching their own dogged tenacity and tactical skill against the lightning strikes and flanking maneuvers of their enemy, the Mantis warriors. The final masterstroke came when the Mantis warriors managed to isolate and entrap the Marines errant 1st and 3rd companies in the Rust zones, and much of the chapter's command structure was destroyed in a series of murderous surgical strikes. With their chapter master, 3rd company captain, and their command staff dead, the Marines errant were decimated and forced to retreat in disarray. In the aftermath, the alliance between them and the Firehawks all but collapsed under bitter recrimination. The secessionist forces continued to make major advances throughout the rest of the year, almost unopposed, with further minor engagement fought amid the ruins of Cygnus and the outer worlds of the Surngran system. The Maelstrom Zone now belonged to Luft Huron.
Yes, go Huron, go Huron, go Huron.
Are you cheerleading for him now?
Yes, he's defeating enemy after enemy and still refusing to pay taxes. He's my idol. Why?
With 5 different chapters of Space Marines now embroiled in open warfare, and a 610 route, along with several naval detachments and the various sectarian factions now involved, in what was rapidly accelerating to become the greatest conflict of its kind since the infamous Fourth Quadrant Rebellion, infamous maybe in name because what is known on it by Lexicanum can fit in one single screen of the wiki page for how little it is, the Imperium's high authorities were forced to finally act. A triumvirate of Imperial legates were dispatched under the seal of the High Lords to pronounce judgment over the ongoing strife in the Maelstrom Zone, and were under orders to leave no stone unturned. The triumvirate was served by a sizable deputation of the Imperial Inquisition of the Ordo Hereticus, an Administratum Auditor task force, and a powerful naval escort battle group assigned from the Segmentum Solar Reserve, and quickly divided their attentions between the different combatants and their backers. Inquisition investigation swiftly uncovered a damning chain of evidence concerning Luft Huron activities and those of his chapter. Charges were laid from the paucity of their return Jinsid to the uncontrovertible evidence of their direct involvement in attacks on Imperial shipping. As for the Cartans, to the Inquisition, their own role in contributing and worsening the unfolding events of the secession smacked at best of gross arrogance, but more likely wanton ambition and misrule. The resolution of the Badab secession crisis was quickly pronounced by the Terran legates to be a matter of the Imperium's security rather than a civil conflict. As a result of this preliminary finding, they issued an immediate demand for the unconditional ceasefire of all parties and the surrender of the secessionists. A demand that was immediately rejected by Luft Huron, with the tyrant stating that complying with the legates' demand would, and once again, I quote,
"Leave our brave worlds and emperor-given charges naked before the enemy."
As a result, orders were issued by the Terran legates for the arrest pending trial of the chapter masters of all the secessionist chapter, and the seizure pending judgment of their worlds, goods, records, and chattels by whatever force was deemed necessary. This order was to be carried out by all loyal forces of the Imperium, wherever so and whoever so they may be. So denounced, the end of the Imperium itself was now turned against lofty Huron and all who stood with him. No longer a bloody feud over commerce and influence between Imperial factions, nor even a deadly vendetta between Space Marine chapters. The conflict was now between the Imperium and those that had turned away from the Emperor's rule, between Loyalist and Secessionist. The Badab War has at this point truly begun. 764-905 M41. With the judgment of the Terran legates, a major deployment of Space Marines was brought into the war to enforce its ruling by any means necessary, chosen from the chapters available in the region and willing to take up arms. The Red Scorpions chapter formed the largest part of what was to become swiftly known as the Loyalist Space Marine contingent. They will be joined by battle companies drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, and Fire Angels chapters, and also the surviving Firehawks and Marines errant ordered to stand down from independent operations and submit to the High Lord's authority for investigation. Let's introduce them all, so we can keep in mind who they are for the rest of the war. Let's start from the Red Scorpions. They are an uncompromising and steadfast chapter. They have, in their 5,000 years of recorded history, always been ready to stand in the defense of the Imperium, fight those who endanger it, and punish those who betray it. They are fanatically loyal to the Emperor, and believe in his divinity without question or doubt, and adhere to the Codex Astartes almost as Holy Scripture. It is unknown from whom they descend from, or to whom their bloodline belongs at all, and even more strangely, their gene seed lacks any form of deterioration or corruption, and bears no specific hallmarks that would allow it to be sourced to one of the original Space Marine legions. They are a crusading chapter and are almost continuously on the move, traveling between war zones and making their forces available to those who will petition their aid. They have fought in every corner of the Imperium over their history, and participated in many great conflicts. Their chapter master when they joined the Badab War was Errant Ortiz. As the second new entry into the war, we have the Salamanders. I doubt they need much of a presentation. First founding chapter descending directly from the Legion of the Salamanders, the legendary warriors and sons of Primarch Vulcan. Honorable to Shan, their chapter master, wasn't present on the battlefields of the Badab War. Then we have the Raptors. They are a chapter of the second founding, one of the few descendants from the sons of Primarch Corvus Corax and his legion, the Raven Guard, created when the reforms of the Codex Astartes were imposed. The Raptors have lost even their own history, and it is unknown who founded them, but it is rumored that the Raptors descend from a company of new initiates training on the Raven Guard homeworld of Deliverance, at the time of the infamous drop site massacre that almost destroyed the Legion.
Wait, those Raptors? They are the Raptors of the events we spoke about in the video The Primaris Mistake.
You are most probably correct, Pio. Go and watch that video if you want to know more about the Raptors and their secrets. Their backstory is detailed there. As descendants of the Raven Guard, they made the art of concealment, secrecy and surprise paramount weapons in their arsenal, and used them to strike the enemy where they can inflict the most damage to achieve their objectives. Their chapter master during the Badab War was Lias Isodon. And last but not least, we have the Fire Angels chapter. This chapter is the most recently founded of all of them, and is considered a rising star in the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes. They were founded in the latter half of M40 by order of the High Lords of Terra, and find their homeworld on the industrialized Highworld of Lorin Alpha in the Western Segmentum Solar. Founded as a chapter from whole cloth, which is to say without a specific name the predecessor chapter, they were created from gene seed belonging to the Ultramarine stock, making them sons of Robute Gilliman. They are extremely religious and see themselves as holy warriors of the Emperor of Mankind. This has brought them to be highly respected and reliable on the battlefields, especially from the forces and authorities of the Imperial Church and the Ecclesiarchy. Their chapter master at the time of the Badab War was and still is unknown. The Marines errant, in parlous condition from their recent losses, complied with the order of the High Lords to submit to authority for investigation and the legate's will. But the Firehawks instead had one last act of bloody vengeance to perform, that has since entered into the history of the Badab War as the infamous firebombing of Sakristan. In what is widely regarded as a strategically wasteful and vainglorious assault, Lazarek of the Firehawks used his surviving chapter fleet, led by the Star Fortress Raptorus Rex, to conduct an orbital assault on the frontier planet of Sakristan, a sovereign world on the edge of the Endymion cluster. Sakristan was a hard-scrabble colony world with a small population, and no real significance other than as one of the worlds that the Mantis warriors had long counted in their domain and responsibility to defend. After smashing through the planet's paltry space defenses and decapitating its rulers and few military assets in a series of savage raids by Firehawk's assault forces, the Raptorus Rex entered a dangerously low orbit, and then proceeded with systematic plasma bombing from the upper atmosphere of the planet. Over several days and nights, Sakristan was laid waste before the Firehawks withdrew from the system, leaving the entire planet aflame, wiping out more than 90% of its population.
I count around 147 war crimes committed by the Firehawks until now. Must be a new record. I'm sure they invented some new war crimes as well.
People in the comments of the last video said that we would end up hating them by the end of this series. They weren't wrong. Away from these events, however, the Loyalist forces had gathered their strength on Josiah Quintus, on the edge of the Carthago sector, and had started making their preparation and organizing themselves for a long campaign of war. Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Freyne of the Ordo Hereticus was in theoretical charge of the Loyalist forces, but in practice it was instead Verant Ortiz, Lord High Commander of the Red Scorpions, who was nominated for overall tactical command of the unified Loyalist Space Marine forces, with the title of Magister Militum, a first among equals, by the commanders of the other Space Marines contingents. The massed Loyalist Space Marine forces, supported by a detachment brought in from the Segmentum Solar Fleet reserves, quickly departed to complete their two main missions. The first was to force the surrender and compliance of all the secessionist chapters to the authority of the legate, and the second was that they were to re-establish and protect commercial links between the worlds of the Maelstrom Zone and the rest of the Imperium. An Imperium in dire need of the resources those worlds produced, to feed the never-ending needs of the Imperial war machine, like we discussed in part 1 of this series. Lord Commander Ortiz's first command was to deploy his own Red Scorpions along with the bulk of Battlefleet solar ships and conduct a series of pushes and feints into the region controlled by the Secession, to gauge their forces and levels of resistance for himself. This was to result in what will be the heaviest naval engagement of the war so far, the indecisive battle of the Silent Reach of 011, 906 and 41. In this engagement, cruiser squadrons of the Maelstrom and Lamenters fleets clashed with Segmentum Solar and the Red Scorpion's warships in the barren void of space between the star systems of Gallen and Griff. The battle proved inconclusive, with vessels from both sides suffering damages, but few major ships from either side lost. The only serious loss incurred was the Maelstrom fleet's flagship for the engagement, the Overlord-class battlecruiser Gauntlet of Wrath. His main bridge was wrecked after a fortunate land strike from the light cruiser Lady Sibalin penetrated its void shields, causing the battlecruiser to run out of control and break away from its escorts. Seeing this unexpected error, several Red Scorpion strike cruisers pounced immediately, and despite the valiant efforts of the Gauntlet's gun crews, they swiftly battered the venerable warship in a close-range crossfire, before finishing her off with raiding parties, leaving the ship a gutted and flaming hulk before her allies could rally to defend her. The Secessionist fleet broke off from the engagement into the warp soon afterwards. This proved to be the largest of a dozen engagements that occurred in a very short space of time in this period, but overall the substantial Loyalist forces quickly succeeded in checking and containing the Secession advance in the early part of 906 and 41, especially after the Marines Errant and Firehawks were cleared of heretical and seditious intent and added the remaining forces to the Loyalist order of battle. But the heavy resistance and defenses of the Maelstrom warders prevented them from making any significant gains in this period. Meanwhile, elsewhere, outside of the borders of the Maelstrom Zone, the scrutiny of the Senatorum Imperialis and the High Lords of Terra also fell on the Carthago sector. Legatine investigations carried out at Sidon Ultra, capital of the Carthago sector, quickly found Imperial commander and Cartan sector governor, the satrap Tanit Koenig, culpable for provoking the war, and she and the heads of her noble house were executed by the Ordo Hereticus for licentious ambition and wanton misrule, and becoming a servant of the Emperor. The findings of the Inquisition into the actions of the Cartans were, in brief, that she and the ruling council had overstepped their authority on numerous counts in the events that led to the Badab War. Now she and those that followed her were put to death, and the Cartans were to pay for their transgressions, with the entire 14 billion strong population of Sidon Ultra committed to indentured servitude for 6 generations, in payment of outstanding debt.
I don't want to say deserved, but deserved.
The arrogance of their nobles caused this mess in the first place. I am surprised they got off easy with just an execution. In 906 and 41, with the secessionist advance effectively contained, Lord Commander Ortiz's next plan of attack was to conduct a series of heavy raids on the Viania system, having determined this to be the target against which the greatest pressure could be placed on the enemy forces. Viania itself was an important world that served as the gatehouse along one of the secondary warp routes around the Maelstrom's rim. Auspex analysis and intelligence sources had labeled its defenses and garrison weaker than the heavily reinforced Sagan system. But what made it an heavier target was that on its surface remained significant unrest from being conquered by the Secessionists that might be stirred up to open revolt by the Loyalist attack and help the Loyalists in retaking it. While the Firehawks and the newly arrived Raptors contingents conducted patrol and escort operations, strike forces drawn from the Red Scorpions, Marines Errant and Nova Marines conducted a three-pronged attack on the Viania system.
From when are they in the war?
The first of several raids carried out in rapid succession. The principal target of these raids was the damaging of Viania's production capacity and orbital transshipping platforms, with the objective of weakening the secessionist grip on the system. This is the first battle where the Loyalist Space Marines will fight the Tyrant's Legion, and their strength had been greatly underestimated by the Loyalist Marines, and as a result the strike groups they sent were largely prevented from achieving many of their goals in this first raid, with only one of the 4 orbital platforms being put out of commission. In addition, while Viania's manufacturing complexes suffered some damage, production was not significantly slowed or affected. Data intercepted from the Viania Command Vox network, however, revealed that the price of resistance was high for the Tyrant's Legion, with the Loyalists inflicting a greater than 178-to-1 estimated kill ratio on the human auxilia defending the system. The last of the Viania raids happened in 906 and 41, and proved particularly bloody for the Tyrant's Legion, as the forces of the Red Scorpions conducted attacks directly into the Kaelian industrial hive, with the specific goal of inflicting mass casualties on the human defenders and picking off their astral close Space Marine masters that were within their ranks. But the control of the secessionist forces held on Viania despite the attacks, and shortly after in 115, 906 and 41, further bad news came for the Loyalists. First, that several military convoys in their rear supply lines from the Carthago sector had been attacked and scattered by an unknown warship that later proved to be the Nightag of the Executioner's chapter, that had now officially joined the war on the side of Huron. And secondly, regarding the fate of Surngrad. The fortress world of Surngrad within the Maelstrom zone had remained independent, its warlords refusing to bend their knee to the tyrant, and their defenses had held out against the secessionist fleet, but Surngrad had partially succumbed thanks to treachery from within, and Huron's forces now controlled its northern citadels, while the southern citadels were barely able of holding out. Surngrad remained too deep within enemy territory to mount an effective relief operation, and the prospect of the ancient fortress world entirely within the secessionist control was a grim prospect, as they would have to actively siege the world to retake it. But a specific event will take place later in the same year, specifically in 390, 906 and 41, that will catapult this war into its most bloody stages, and this event is renowned as the Betrayal at Griff. With a stalemate reached in the war, unexpectedly, it was the secessionist side and Huron that broke off the standoff with a remarkable proposal. Luft Huron personally sent emissaries to the Loyalists, offering a temporary ceasefire and honorable parley with the Loyalist commander Verant Ortiz, in order to avoid further bloodshed between those who should be, and I quote again from Huron,
"Loyal brothers."
Despite Legate Inquisitor Freyne objections, Ortiz agreed to the meeting, trusting to Huron's word as a chapter master to keep the truce, even if Ortiz was iron in his resolve to carry out the judgment of the High Lords. After arrangements were made for a face-to-face contact between the Tyrant and the Magister Militum on an abandoned space station in orbit of the gas giant Shedim, in the outer reaches of the System of Grief, what would happen next remains a point of contention and cloudy enigma to this day, and much of what we know and will be narrating building is reconstructed from damaged and recovered records. The station itself was once a naval supply depot built into an asteroid mass, and abandoned due to solar flare activity some centuries before. A remnant of atmosphere still remained on it, but it was otherwise dead. As arranged, each party approached the way station in a single unescorted strike cruiser. Each leader and their honor guard was deposited on the asteroid by a Thunderhawk, their respective strike cruisers pulling away outside of weapons range, as the two parties met in a great cargo vault at the heart of the ruined station. From the records that were later recovered, it was plain that matters immediately became volatile and acrimonious. Huron acted as if Ortiz and his forces had contravened Imperial law, and not himself and the Maelstrom warders that had seceded from the Imperium. In the honor guard of Huron was also Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, who directly accused the Firehawks chapter of perpetrating wanton crimes of genocide against civilian populations loyal to the Imperium and the Emperor.
I mean, there is no need to accuse. I kept a list, and I'm sure some of the war crimes on it didn't exist before the Firehawks started exterminating people at random.
Is that list updated to the latest Night Lord's records?
No, because I didn't have enough paper to print it otherwise.
Sartak of the Mantis Warriors also asked for the chapter master of the Firehawks, Lazarek, to be brought to trial by combat for his crimes. Huron himself, in imperious mood, commenced a ranting diatribe against his enemies, and their perceived enormities and insults, going so far as to suggest that Ortiz himself should bow down before him, and fight under the tyrant's banner against those who will turn the Astartes into, and once more, I quote,
"No more than lick-spittle slaves of their own petty greed."
Verant Ortiz, for his part, stood firm, and reiterated the legatine writ of authority and the unassailable right of summons. As the talks became heated, an adjournment was called for, and both parties withdrew to separate compartments on the station to confer with their fellows. It is at this point that records regarding this incident become confused and extremely contradictory with each other, especially as to what happened next as Loyalist communications to their strike cruiser were suddenly cut off. What is known, though, is that 3 unknown vessels, 2 of them marked by Auspex logs as likely to be Iconoclast pattern raiders, a design used by renegades of the Imperium, and a 3rd light cruiser-sized vessels of unknown provenance, attacked from concealed positions deep within the thick atmosphere of the gas giant the space station orbited. The attackers assaulted the asteroid base before either Loyalist or Secessionist vessels could respond, wrecking the derelict station with weapons fire before boarding with a raiding party comprised of heretics, mutants, and other renegades. In the confused battle that followed, it is known that the Loyalist delegation, including the revered Red Scorpion Chapter Master, Lord Commander Verant Ortiz, were killed, and several members of Huron's party, including Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, were also slain, but exactly how this occurred remains unknown. In the 3-way space battle that resulted around the station, the Red Scorpion Chief Librarian Servin Lot led a desperate counter-assault on the station via assault ram and teleporter attack. At the height of the battle, the larger unknown vessel, badly stricken by fire from the Astral Claw's strike cruiser, crashed into the station and exploded, causing the asteroid it was based upon to slowly break up in a cascade of debris. Despite this rolling destruction, Severin Lot succeeded in recovering his fallen master's remains, the Red Scorpions clashing with both the Raiders and Huron's astral claws within the disintegrating asteroid base, before both sides broke free from the station to avoid certain death.
Veteran Brother Dane armored his soul with a litany of contempt as nothingness took him. The crackling scream of the machine was abruptly cut away by obliterating silence as a brief moment of blackness consumed everything. The uncanny non-sensation was ended by a sudden crawling lightning beneath his skin, which told him the teleporter field was fading, and he had no more than a moment before the crushing force of gravity held him again. In an instant, a hoarfrost covering of ice sheeted his ancient suit of Terminator armor as he translated back into real space, shadows suddenly clawing at his hulking frame. He began to move even before he had fully registered his surroundings. His right arm sweeping up, chain fist howling as more than a century of combat experience was channeled into smooth and lethal action. The whirling teeth met scant resistance, and the thing he had killed fell away, bisected into 2 steaming chunks by the armored gauntlet's shredding blade. Gunfire pulsed in the dark, and las rounds or something very like them spattered off his shoulder guard as the data displays on the inside of his visor finally rolled back into stability, feeding him information about the vaulted chamber into which he and his squad had teleported. The enemy were already falling all around him, the red scorpions of his squad marking their targets and killing them with brutal efficiency, stone bolters flashing in the darkness. A second later, there was silence. Squad Darak, fan out, dispersion Lambda, we must move with speed to rendezvous with the revered Loth. Let none leave who stand against us. Dane paused for a moment, shining his arc lamp down on the remains of the dead. They had been human ones. Now crude void adaptations and vulcanized pressure suits were hammered and sutured into their flesh. Crude alchematics fused into their eye sockets. The dead things' shattered limbs were still twitching where their drug injectors were still attached. The filth of the maelstrom. The atmosphere within the derelict station was decade stale, razor thin and killing cold. The Space Marines' armor steamed as they advanced, Dane's chain fist making short work of the rusted bulkheads. The squad fell in behind him as he carved and smashed as direct a route as possible through the ancient hall. Scrolling tactical data showed their position inside the asteroid base, flashing with static bursts caused by the force unleashed in the void outside where the battle still raged between their ship and those of the treacherous enemy. The blurred locator returns showed the squad and the others. Squad Royale was encountering heavy fire in the upper galleries, where their assault ram had careened through the empty station fuel tanks, while down on the sub-levels, Squad Junari had found its path impassively blocked by megatons of collapsed wreckage. Only Dane's own squad were close enough to reach Loth's location in time, as already the asteroid base was starting to break apart. They must not fail. Hostile contact! Brother Cardin shouted as the thin air erupted with streaks of flame from above. Dane brought his assault cannon around to face the new threat, the barrel spinning up to speed with a high-pitched buzz. His autosenses locked onto the targets advancing from an upper deck across the vaulted gantries. They were different from the last foes. Heavy, regular shapes advancing with measured discipline, their interlaced fire patterns precise and targeted. Space Marines. Bolter fire exploded against his helmet's faceplate, seeking near non-existent chinks in his tactical dreadnought armor. Base traders, turncoat brothers, Huron lapdogs. Dane thought, who else could it be? If the signal was true and Lord Commander Ortiz was dead by the tyrant's betrayal, then there could not be enough dead Astraclaws to pay the blood price. Despite his battle calm, Dane felt himself sneer viciously as he unleashed the assault cannon, and the 2-meter tongue of muscle flash lit up the darkness of the broken iron chamber. Above him, the gantry disintegrated into metal splinters and leaping sparks, eaten away in seconds by the barrage of explosive shells. First one, then two, then a third armored figure fell with the gantry debris, severed limbs, shattered ceramite, and smoldering bodies crashing down before him. Not enough! Not nearly enough!
Severin Loth had saved the honor of his chapter against all odds, and in doing so wrote an enduring legend for himself despite the bitter blow that the Scorpions had suffered. As for Huron, he appears to have made his escape early on, and what end he had in the deaths of Lord Commander Ortiz and Chapter Master Sartak cannot be confirmed. Claim and counterclaim ensued, with many blaming Huron's perfidy for the attack, claiming it as rank treachery, while the secessionists themselves lay blame at the door of the Inquisition as a plot to assassinate the tyrant by covert means. But communications sent out by Legate Inquisitor Frayne to his brethren are even more open to conclusion, not excluding the possibility of external intervention of third parties, who could benefit by the war continuing, and by the whole region descending into anarchy and bloodshed. But another conclusion seems more likely. Frayne theorizes that this was a plot by Huron not to assassinate Verant Ortiz, but rather Chapter Master Sartak of the Mantis Warriors, as evidence from the time was uncovered of growing disquiet among the Mantis Warriors in their support for the secession. And from here, things will just get worse for both sides as the war went on.
While I do think Huron might be the one behind the plot, I can't rule out the Inquisition either. We have talked in other videos of how they act when challenged.
Yes, to be honest, I do believe it might have been outside intervention. The Maelstrom was becoming too safe for the forces hostile to the Imperium residing in it. They needed for it to fall into chaos, no pun intended, or they would over time be wiped out as Huron and the Warders became more and more active into expanding their domain. Thing that would make their unpredictable and chaotic assaults against the Imperium harder and harder to pull off, pun intended. End of 906 M41, beginning of 907 M41. The death of Chapter Master Ortiz temporarily delivered the strategic initiative into the hands of the secessionist cause, and the number of raids against Imperial shipping lanes and convoys increased. Heavy Space Marine escort forces were needed in order to maintain access to the world of Gallen and Chimera, while the Pale Stars Legion was all but entirely cut off. For a time it was the Loyalists now that were pressed to hold the little ground they had taken in the Maelstrom Zone, and this lasted until the situation was eased by the arrival of contingents of the Howling Griffons, Nova Marines, and later Sons of Medusa chapters.
How many chapters are against Huron by this point? I lost count.
Many, and he's holding all of them at bay, but for now let's introduce all of them. The Nova Marines, that for some reason were named even earlier as participating in the war, but technically they have joined just now, consistency isn't the forte of Imperial Armour, are an ancient and proud chapter of Space Marines that adhere fully to the Codex Astartes, that they see as divinely ordained law. They are one of the few chapters of Marines so radical in their views that they would be considered under the monodominant outlook of the Inquisition, espousing a doctrine of complete extermination of all intelligent alien life in the galaxy in order to ensure the survival of humanity. They were founded by Lucretius Corvo, a highly honored captain of the Ultramarines Legion, who served as one of the Legion champions during the brutal fight against the traitor Warbearers Legion on Astagar during the Horus Heresy. They are in fact a second founding chapter directly descending from the original Ultramarines Legion. At their founding, the Nova Marines swore an oath to defend the Segmentum Ultima from all enemies of mankind, and as such joined their fellow Loyalists against Secessionist forces when the news of the war reached them. Then we have the Howling Griffons. Their origins are unknown, but it is estimated that they were founded in M33, as they are recorded being active from that time onward. They are so old that they are recorded fighting in many of the major wars the Imperium has suffered throughout the millennia, from the Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler to the Plague of Unbelief. The chapter is notably well provided in both arms and war gear, as they are always fighting in the most bitterly contested campaigns. Their forge is so ancient and so extensive to keep them supplied that they are one of the few chapters capable of manufacturing some rarer Space Marine equipment, such as the Land Raider Prometheus and advanced Mark 8 errant power armors in noteworthy numbers. This chapter has a particular vendetta that pushed them against traitor forces, especially if those traitor forces are word bearers, for reasons you can learn by doing more research into them, but their bellicose nature drew them to join the Loyalists when the war reached the ears of the Howling Griffons. And the last chapter that at the moment joined the war is the Sons of Medusa. They are a chapter with an history of ruthless efficiency and merciless persecution of the Imperium's foe. As the name already implied, they descend from the lineage of the Iron Hands, as the homeworld of the Iron Hands is in fact called Medusa. They are estimated to have been created in the early 35th millennium, during a period named in Imperial history as Nova Terra Interregnum. A period of division and civil war in which the Imperium became fractured into warring and disparate factions which cut across the lines of the Adeptas and turned former allies into enemies. Which saw even the Iron Hands become fractured when something called the Moirai doctrines were embraced by a significant percentage of the chapter, and the solution given by the Iron Hands Great Clan Council to avoid civil war in the chapter was simple: exile the minority that had embraced these doctrines and sign a treaty on both sides binding them to never raise arms against their former brothers. It is these and more exiles from Iron Hands chapters, exiled during what is known as the Moirai Schism, that will later reorganize into the forces of the Sons of Medusa.
With all these chapters involved in the war at this point, we can just call the war a book.
If I had another virus bomb, I would be sending you to Madrengard this time, Pio. Anyway, after the arrival of these chapters and their reinforcements, a new Lord Commander was appointed for the Red Scorpions, called Karab Kuln, and he was also elected to be the new Magister Militum for the Loyalist forces, like his predecessor. Kuln quickly took control of the situation, and one of his first acts was to bring forward plans to convert the old way station on the largely abandoned mining world of Hallows Point in a major staging ground. This became the primary Loyalist base in the Maelstrom Zone, and with ships and materials moved into the system with haste, Vengeance Station, as it became known, was fully operational in under a standard year. Even before the station was complete though, the Loyalists had resumed the offensive initiatives and were conducting a renewed phase of aggressive operations, opening as their spearhead were the Red Scorpions, as the entire chapter was particularly eager for battle. In the closing days on 906 and 41, the Red Scorpions and their chapter strike cruisers fought in dozens of separate void actions, from defending convoys to raiding outposts and interception of enemy shipping alongside the Raptor's chapter, turning the tables for the first time from the beginning of the conflict against Huron's raiders. At the same time, the Nova Marines and Sons of Medusa carried out probing attacks into the region of the Endymion cluster, and against the edges of the Sagan system, in order to maintain pressure on the Secessionists and keep their forces as pinned down as possible. The first major fruits of this new campaign were the garrisoning of the barren Chimera system and the setting up there of several outposts and listening stations, and a new ability to conduct sustained operations in the contested Gargatea system. Swiftly, the poisonous fence and corrosive jungles of Gargatea 3 turned into a savage battleground as raptors, salamanders and fire angels clashed against the astral claws and mantis warriors, amid the tangled and often lethal vegetation. The war on Gargatea swiftly developed into a series of running cat-and-mouse engagements of ambush and counterattack, with the advantage swinging back and forth between the two sides. As one of the few life-sustaining worlds in the region, and a useful navigational way station, Gargatea 3 remained a contested world of vital strategic importance right up until the end of 907 and 41, when the secessionist forces were finally displaced from the planet and the system reclaimed for the Loyalists. At this point, with the arrival of fresh marines to replace them on the battlefields, the Marines errant first took up reserve duty for the remainder of 906 and 41, before they withdrew entirely from the Badab war early in 907 and 41, with some acrimony attached for their leave-taking. The increasingly embittered survivors of the Firehawks chapter were forcibly retired to the rearguard for a time by the newly appointed Lord Commander Karab Kuln of the Red Scorpions, to avoid further trouble in the ranks of the Loyalist forces.
A few dozen war crimes too late.
This deployment, though, proved strategically effective, as the presence of the Raptorus Rex at Allow Point protected the Loyalist facility while under construction. This was vital when Allow's Point was raided in 810, 906 and 41 by secessionist fire ships and frigate squadrons led by a trio of Lamenters chapter strike cruisers. The attack, although well executed, was repulsed without major damage to the half-finished base and anchorage, the concentrated firepower of the Raptorus Rex alongside the Red Scorpion's battle badge Sword of Ordon proving a decisive factor. A further consequence of the battle at Allow's Point was the fate of one of the Lamenters strike cruisers, the Inflexible, which proved so badly damaged after being rammed by the Firehawks destroyer Ravage during the battle, that even though it escaped from the system, the ship was forced to stop out of the warp near the Forbidden Star of Iruko during its retreat, and was subsequently lost with all on board in unknown circumstances.
My poor boys.
Further reinforcements arrived to the Loyalist ranks month by month, and a missive arrived to the Lord Commander from the Adeptus Terra, informing them that other Space Marine chapters were en route to join them. The scales were beginning to tip in the Loyalist favor. All available intelligence on the Secessionists indicated that they had fallen into a defensive stance, and were further digging in and fortifying their key systems. At this point, Lord Commander Kuln knew that he must press his advantage soon, or risk the war devolving into a slow battle of attrition that would bleed his forces dry. The first move towards this would be the relief of the fortress ward of Sorngrad. His southern continental citadels were still managing to hold out against the secessionist aggression by dint of heroic self-sacrifice and bloody-minded faith in the God Emperor, born of a millennia in the shadows of the Maelstrom and his many horrors. But even this could not last much longer. The Raptors and the Salamanders were the chapters given this task of intervention, and they deployed a strike force on a long-range incursion mission behind secessionist lines in the battle barge Spire of Glory and War Talon. On arrival in the system, not even their combined firepower was enough to affect a landing, and they were forced to pull back, the War Talon suffering heavy damage in the failed assault. Neither chapter, however, were ready to admit defeat, and after the gathering of intelligence from the beleaguered Sangrad Southers, a highly unorthodox battle plan dubbed Operation Sedna was quickly formulated and put into action. Under the cloud created by a series of diversionary attacks in the Equatorial Territory, the Raptors successfully landed a strong force of battle brothers covertly in field-modified armor over 300 kilometers away from their chosen target. They decided not to use heavy gear or vehicles to stay hidden to the auspex and thermal detectors, and after advancing on foot for weeks through the rolling ice packs and bitter tundra, launched their assault under the cover of a blinding gale. After breaching the fortress walls of the main orbital defense complex with melta-bombs, they gained entrance and succeeded in sabotaging the base weapon silos, despite taking heavy casualties from the Astral Claws who bitterly contested their attack.
Astral Claws? How? They are literally everywhere and fighting on every battlefield. How many did Huron make?
You would like to know, Pio? I'm sure some people noticed that I mentioned during the video that it was suspicious even for the Loyalists that they were still fighting like at full strength. Wait a bit and you will see how many he made. Now free to move into close orbit, the two battle barges descended to bombard the planet from the upper atmosphere. smashing the secessionist held positions into surrender, and finally liberating Surngrad from the grasp of Huron's forces. With Surngrad once more into Loyalist hands, the task of quickly rebuilding the planet's defenses went to the Salamanders, as the War Talon Empire of Glory stayed as sentries in orbit, ready to intervene in case of a counterattack. Surngrad marked a turning point in the war, and the beginning of a potential wedge that could be driven down the middle of the secessionist worlds. But before anything more could be gained, dire news came from the Howling Griffons stationed at the Chimera system of a deadly new threat. 907 M41 began with a disastrous defeat for the Loyalist forces. The bulk of the Executioner's chapter arrived in force in the Maelstrom Zone, and upon meeting with their advance force aboard the flagship of the chapter, the Nightag, they conducted an immediate surprise attack at Chimera. This at a stroke succeeded in destroying the Loyalist outpost, listening station, and the vital astropathic relay complex on the night moons of the Chimera system. Outnumbered as well as overwhelmed by the force and speed of the assault, the Howling Griffons chapter forces garrisoning the Chimera system fought brutally as the bastions and stations on the planet fell one after the other, despite their defense. The blood of the Howling Griffons spilled into the airless dust, as they sought to prevent the Executioners from overwhelming and annihilating the Loyalist emplacement. Once the strategic objectives were achieved, the Executioners withdrew from the field, even if it was in their power to kill the remaining Loyalist survivors if they so wished. This provoked consternation from lofty Huron, but aware of the dangerous temperament of the Executioner's commander, the High Chaplain Tulsa Kane, he didn't send any formal reprimand to them, instead welcoming them into the battle for the secessionist cause. Mid-907, M41. Perhaps unsurprisingly given the tide of war that had at this point overtaken the Maelstrom Zone, attacks from unaligned raiding forces and Xenos races that lived and hid in the Maelstrom Zone dramatically increased, reaching a new height during 907 and 41. The brooding malevolence of the Maelstrom behind them, and the Loyalists to the fore, it is apparent that the Secessionists suffered the worst at the hand of non-aligned forces during the Badab War. During this period, Orc Gorchomp, a pirate clan warband, spilled from the Greenskins-infested Kala system with a score to settle. Their terror ships assaulted secessionist supply convoys between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector, and ultimately gave battle to the Mantis warriors at Endymion itself. There, a force of Orklanders put down an estimate 20,000 boys strong warband, equipped with a profusion of battle wagons, buggies, and cans of many types, which proceeded to slaughter the planet's meager garrison. The Mantis warriors were forced to pull back and counter-invade Endymion, lest they lose the world, meeting the orcs in a rapid-moving land battle on the dust plains of Oarella. Here, the chapter's Predator and Razorback squadrons, supported by wave after wave of Thunder or gunship airstrikes, succeeded in pulling out a 50-kilometer-long zigzag trail of burning orc wrecks, and shredded bodies by repeated feigned retreats in front of the enraged orcs. The orc attack against the cluster was extremely serious, but far worse in potential implication was the growing threat of the demon-tainted Corsair cults based on the blighted world of Magog, whose increase in power had actually driven forth the recently defeated orcs. Soon the Secessionists were forced to take preemptive action and launch a direct assault of that hellish planet, which despite a prior Exterminatus campaign, had long remained a thorn in the Maelstrom Warder's side. An Astral Close battle barge under the command of Corian Sumatris, one of Huron's most seasoned battle leaders, was recalled from the front lines to conduct an attack on Magog, along with 2 companies of the chapter and a strong force of Astral Claws and Lamenters Terminators, handpicked for the mission. The losses suffered during the decapitation raid on Magog were high, but the Tyrant knew that they could ill afford not to take the opportunity to cut off the threat while it was still forming. Had they not done so, they could have raised a war on 2 fronts if they allowed the horrors being birthed on Magog to reach their fruition. But by doing so, they were unable to reinforce their flank when a fresh enemy took to the conflict stage. But before that, Pio, it is the moment.
What moment?
Do you remember what I said during the video of the Space Marines against the Inquisition, Pio, about the Tiger Claws?
No, it was months ago. I have a life to live in the basement you lock me in when a video ends.
The rest of the events involving the surviving Tiger Claws will have to wait until I decide to make a video that talks about the Badab War.
Oh, come on, you can't end a video like that. Oh yeah, that.
Well, it is time to conclude that story.
Wait, you programmed this for months? And various videos we already made contain stories and parts of lore that go even deeper into some of the stories mentioned in the Badab War. Were you planning all of this from that video?
Maybe.
Are you sure you're not Alfarius?
Oh, don't be ridiculous, Pio. In 151, 908, and 41, an inquisitorial interrogation of an Astral Claws apothecary captured during the battle for Sungrad Polar Fortress revealed to the genuine shock of his interrogators that the prisoner was not in fact an Astral Claw to begin with, but was in fact a former member of the Tiger Claws, a chapter long thought lost. During the interrogation, the Tiger Claw revealed that they had come into contact with their parent chapter after their last chapter master, former Captain Vetala, had traveled to Terra to petition for the reconstruction of his chapter, and there disappeared without a trace. After reaching in secret the Astral Claws and Huron, and explaining the situation, Huron had realized that their descendant chapter was in the aim of the Inquisition, and because they descended from the Astral Claws, it decided to offer the last company of Tiger Claws left a place in the Astral Claws, to hide and fight side by side as brothers, and give relief to the Astral Claws that by that point were stretched thin from the fighting. If you want to know exactly what happened to the Tiger Claws before this point, just go and watch the video on the Space Marines against the Inquisition we released, but for the rest, this is where their story ends. The Inquisition from that point unleashed in utter secrecy a planned series of stalk and capture raids by Space Marine and Inquisition forces, operating within the Maelstrom, and evidence was quickly amassed of an unforeseen and terrible heresy that had been pursued by the Astral Claws and Luft Huron for more than a century. This evidence in fact proved that, at Luft Huron orders, the chapter deliberately withheld the Astral Claws gene seed, not to replenish the chapter's own losses, but in order to save their near-extinct kin in the Tiger Claws. This sin, compounded and compounded again, had led Huron and the Astral Claws to another far more dangerous act. Repeatedly denied the reinforcements he had requested to aid him and the Maelstrom warders in carrying out their tasks, Luft Huron, in his monumental arrogance and pride, has sought to expand his own forces far past the levels mandated by the Codex Astartes. For at least 100 years before the outbreak of the conflict, the Astral Claws' secret goal had been the transformation of their chapters slowly into a force equal to a Space Marine Legion of old. By this example, Luft Huron, it appears, sought at first not to rebel against the Imperium, but to prove his case by deeds writ in blood, a Maelstrom scourged clean, and a new realm carved out for mankind in the Emperor's name. Regardless of the folly of such a plan, it was doomed by the fickle hand of fate. Up until the outbreak of the conflict, he had sought to hide and steadily build up his forces, dispersed among the far-flung stars of the Maelstrom Zone, and far away from prying eyes. But then came the Tide Fleet, and the threat of direct scrutiny that he could not afford to tolerate, and with it came war, a war too early in the Tyrant's plan and against entirely the wrong enemy. Immediately, unexplained factors about the war, the rates of attrition, and the reported strength of the secessionist enemy were cast into a new light.
New light?
I have hinted for the whole video that too many Astral Claws were fighting on too many battlefields. In every engagement it seemed that the Astral Claws were present in one way or another, and in fact, upon scrutiny and body counting, the Inquisitors discovered concrete proof of the heresy of Huron. They discovered in fact that more than 1,000 Astral Claws had already been killed in the war. Further covert investigation uncovered the fact that the Astral Claws Apothecarion had been conducting heretical experiments in rapid zygote cultivation. While largely unsuccessful, thanks to the use of his unsubmitted gene seed, the Astral Claws chapter now stood at around an estimated 3,500 battle brothers strong. In the face of this wanton heresy and deceit, and invoking all his full emergency authority, Inquisitor Legate Jarndyce Freyne condemned the entire Astral Claws chapter as excommunicate traitoris, under sentence of death, and placed their allies under official suspicion of heresy and treasonous contravention of Imperial high law. This fact fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict, and a wall of secrecy descended over the Badab War. At Freyne's insistence, Further Ordo Hereticus forces and regiments of Scholar Progenius stormtroopers are also called up, with the intention of following behind the Space Marines' battle lines, to conduct full inquest on each world reclaimed from the Tyrant grasp to root out the full extent of this heresy.
Wait, that means...
Yes, Pio. This isn't a war of loyalists against renegades anymore. It is now a war of loyalists against traitors and heretics. Returning to the war, in 440, 907 and 41, the Minotaurs, a powerful fleet-based chapter of dark renown and secret ties to the Adeptus Terra, arrived in full strength in the Maelstrom Zone. The Minotaurs are renowned for their unflinching determination in battle, with their chapter master, Asterion Moloch, being the fiercest of its warriors. They are renowned because they are especially good at one thing, fighting and exterminating other Space Marine chapters. They are one of the most dangerous chapters you can face in the Void, and they will show proof of that in short order.
The battle now evolved from a book to an encyclopedia.
They announced their presence in the war by launching a full chapter-scale attack on the Secessionist-dominated mining facilities on Cairo, wiping out the 46,000-strong Tyrant's Legion garrison and rendering the mine works unusable before moving on. The Minotaurs then sent a ship and officially presented themselves to the Loyalist Council of War, but their master, the darkly famed Asterion Moloch, remained with his chapter as they proceeded to maraud through the Pale Stars region, striking a pre-planned list of targets in a deliberate effort to decimate rather than conquer the resources production facilities of the region, and thereby begin to starve the secessionist war effort. The Minotaurs' attacks were indiscriminate, targeting not only the 30+ minor worlds and stations the secession had taken direct control over, but also overlooked independent minor outposts, and even those that had stayed loyal to their distant Cartan masters. While the Minotaurs coordinated their efforts with the Loyalist command network, they operated largely independently in the southern Maelstrom Zone, striking targets amid the Pale Stars and then a Stellar Drift's border regions. In these battles, the viciousness of the chapter's reputation for leaving no survivors among those that resisted them grew quickly, and remained uncontested until another savage chapter joined the war later on, but this is not the time to name them yet. Only the warships and strike forces of the Executioners seemed able to slow down the Minotaurs' progress in the southern Maelstrom Zone, the two chapters almost enjoying their battles as a kind of bloody sport. During the remainder of the year, the Minotaurs gained several important victories, effectively destroying the Tyrant's Legion force on Crow's World and Larsa in a series of savage and violent planet strikes, and forcing the Astral Claws and their puppet worlds to move from static, prepared positions or risk having their worlds isolated and ravaged one by one. Thanks to the direct and collateral damage the Minotaurs' operations caused, it is estimated that within 1/3 of a standard year of their arrival in the region, the human population of the Pale Stars alone was reduced by more than 20%.
Inquisitor Cryptman would be proud.
I think Korn would be prouder. The Minotaurs stayed on purpose out of the general chain of command of the Loyalist, distancing themselves from the other chapters and deferring to Legate Inquisitor Freyne more often than High Commander Koln or his advisors. This distance was shown in that their standing representative for the War Council was the gaunt and taciturn Chaplain Encomi, whose red-rimmed eyes observed all, although he barely raised a word during the gatherings. There is no record of Asterion Moloch ever putting in a personal appearance at Council, and the only evidence he was present in the war at all comes from picked footage recovered from battle scans and fearful stories spread by the few survivors of the Minotaurs' attacks. By the end of 907 and 41, thanks to a series of severe battles and brutally contested boarding actions, the Secessionists began to be pushed back from several key systems and suffered severe losses. In a further blow to the secessionist cause, Viania, subject to repeated attack for the last few years, finally fell to the Loyalists after a massive joint assault by the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions chapters. Already bled dry by the secessionists and stripped of its heavy arms so that they might be used to shore up defenses elsewhere, Lufty Huron had all but abandoned the world, and the sizable Tyrant's Legion garrison stationed there to their fate. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal, as drop pods rained from the skies onto the streets of industrial plazas of the proto-hive of Kaelian in a night assault, which rent the darkness with flame. Thrown into panic and disarray by the assault, the Limarra squadrons and infantry auxilia phalanxes of the Tyrant's Legion fired on each other in the confusion, as the Angels of Death fell among them, and the city became a tangled and confused butcher's yard. By dawn, Viania was in Loyalist hands, and the Tyrant's Legion garrison was put to the sword. 908 and 41 to 910 and 41. Evidence acquired by inquisitorial agents in early 907 and 41 revealed that contacts were discovered between the Astral Claws, renegade human elements, and heretic scavengers from the Golgothan Wastes. Between them, they had devised a plan to recover buried weapons stored on the dead world of Signax. In response, the Loyalist forces first blockaded the planet, before conducting a grid sweep of the world as the numerically inferior secessionists and renegades went to ground in the shattered hive cities, relying on the hellish terrain and radiation-fogged atmosphere to prevent them being easily discovered. The Scourging of Synax required a determined and brutal campaign to scout out the Tyrant's forces, the conduct of which caused some discord between the Sons of Medusa and Space Marines of the Exorcist chapter.
When did they join the war? Marines chapters are just popping in now.
The accusations from the Exorcist were that the Sons of Medusa were more interested in serving their own hidden designs on Cyganex than in hunting down the enemy as brutally as possible. The smaller Exorcist force was soon withdrawn and redeployed in the forthcoming assault on the Sagan system, while the Sons of Medusa were left to liquidate the Cyganex threat as they saw fit. 330, 908, and 41. In a major planetary assault, the Secessionists were driven from their fortresses on Sagan by the largest combined Loyalist forces so far fielded in the Badab War. Utilizing the massive strength of the Fire Angels, Red Scorpions, and Exorcists, supported by assault specialized forces drawn from the Salamanders, Raptors, and Nova Marines. The fight improved particularly bloody, and rather than give up the strategically vital system, the Secessionists chose to mount a defense at any cost. This ultimately destroyed a sizable component of their own battle line, the Astral Claws resorting to the use of viral weapons that slew tens of thousands of the world's population in a desperate attempt to either drive the Loyalists from the planet or render it unusable by either side. Here, in the maze of storage compounds and tabulation houses on the formerly Administratum-controlled world's surface, the Fire Angels, fighting in full chapter strength, carried the brunt of the Loyalist casualties, valiantly sacrificing themselves in order to contain the Astral Claw's last-ditch, borderly suicide attacks. The Second Battle of Sagan resulted in the highest death toll of any single engagement of the war thus far, as well as the loss of several key Secessionist warship in a vain counterattack on the system. Despite paying a heavy price in blood for their prize, the successful invasion of Sagan was a major turning point in the war, with the system becoming the Loyalist primary base in the Maelstrom Zone, and affording them greater access to the Maelstrom Zone's primary stable warp routes, while also denying those routes to the enemy. Soon afterward, using Sagan as its supply point, Songrad was fully relieved and reinforced, and the Endymion suppression campaign began, effectively forcing the remaining Mantis warriors into a purely defensive posture, and isolating them from Badab and their allies. This effectively split the Maelstrom Zone, relegating the Secessionists into two regions, the Endymion cluster and the still unbreached and heavily defended Badab sector itself. From this point onward, the Secessionist aggression would be limited to commerce raids and targeted strikes, primarily carried out by the vessels of the Executioners and Lamenters chapters. Now, finally numbers go down a bit. Between 908 and 909 M41, beyond the Badab sector, massive orc incursions and multiple WAGs erupted, threatening the safety of the Ultima Segmentum. As the Badab Secessionists were judged now to be effectively contained, the Loyalist forces of the Nova Marines, Raptors and Auli Griffons, all of which have suffered battlefield attrition to some degree, were one by one withdrawn from the conflict in managed stages as part of a major Imperium-wide strategic redeployment, along with a number of warships of Segmentum Solar Reserve forces, which had been deployed to the Loyalist cause. And now, Pio, I fear the worst part of the video is coming for you.
Why?
We will now talk of how the Lamenters have been defeated in the Badab War.
Oh no, my poor lamenting boys.
888, 908, and 41. The Lamenters chapter had already suffered significant losses through attrition, the fleet-based chapter having been in continuous deployment defending the southern Badab sector, as well as serving escort duty to many supply convoys, but they were still a force to be reckoned with. A plan was put into action to isolate them from Huron's cause and take them out of the war in a single battle. Legate Inquisitor Frayn's insidious spy network, in concert with long-range augury scans and scouting missions conducted across the southern Maelstrom Zone, provided the Loyalists with valuable information on the chapter's movements and deployments. What was immediately obvious to them was that the chapter was being used as an ablative shield by the Tyrant of Badab to guard his southern flank and contest the Loyalist domination of the Pale Stars, while he kept the bulk of the Astral Claws in reserve, near Badab itself. Seizing on this weakness, the Minotaurs chapter was gathered in strength to wait for an opening to strike where they would be most effective. That opportunity came in 888, 908, and 41, when the location of the Lamenter chapter Bork named Mater Lacrimarum was discovered in orbit over the feral world of Optera, taking on supplies. Immediately a rapid strike force was dispatched to attack the ship, and succeeded in catching it and crippling its main drives, preventing it from fleeing the system. The Borg, which carried both the chapter's recovery in battle wounded and its precious resource of gene seed, was a target the Lamenters could not help but try to defend at any cost, and so the trap was sprung.
I mean, who wouldn't? From what you said, the ship is pretty much the Lamenters' hospital and transport for the wounded. Do the Minotaurs have no honor?
Honor is different than duty, Pio. Keep that in mind in every errant conflict. Lured in by a continuing series of attacks on the Borg, the bulk of the Lamenters' fleet carrying with it much of the chapter were drawn back to the Optera system, without further reinforcement from the Secessionist cause. Once there, they were then engaged by the full power of the Minotaurs chapter, in a bloody battle which lasted 17 standard hours, and was fought in the most brutal ship-to-ship fighting imaginable, and upon the rocky surface of Optera 5. The Minotaurs suffered heavy casualties, but in the end overpowered their enemy by virtue of their own brutality and sheer weight of numbers. With their forces shattered, the remaining Lamenters were forced to surrender rather than risk total annihilation once the Borg had been taken and much of their fleet was left wrecked or burning. Having suffered serious losses themselves in defeating the Lamenters, the Minotaurs claimed salvage rights to the crippled remnants of much of the Lamenters' fleet and the war gear of the Fallen. The surviving Lamenters, barring a few that remained at Huron's side during the battle, were incarcerated on a prison hall orbiting the night side of Sagan II, amid rumors of their growing insanity in confinement. Including the casualties captured in the chapter's Apothecarium during the battle, only 311 Lamenters' battle brothers survived to be interned on the prison hulk for the rest of the war. This permanently knocked the Lamenters out of the Badab War. (897, 908, and 41). In one of the most remarkable operations of the Badab War, the Loyalists intervened in matters unfolding on the world of Angstrom. The sovereign independent Adeptus Mechanicus domain of Angstrom in Eastern Maelstrom Zone had remained neutral so far throughout the conflict, rejecting diplomatic missions and threats from both sides to join with them in the war. The Magos of Angstrom considered the conflict itself no more than an internal dispute between competing Imperial factions, in which they had no cause to interfere, and had made known their intention to defend their territorial sovereignty against all trespassers. Instead of taking sides, Angstrom has simply continued its operations as usual, which included fulfilling a long-standing agreement to render up a bounty of advanced weapons and refined ores to be collected by the Imperium's representatives on a 3-yearly cycle from the edge of their planetary system. The Magos care not for which of the Imperium servants retrieved the bounty, only that their part of the arrangement was carried out to the letter. In the past, this bounty has supplied the Maelstrom Warders with a vital resource, and the Tyrant's servants continue to be in the perfect position to collect it, greatly aiding their war effort. This unique arrangement was to result in one of the most singular incidents of the war, as the Red Scorpions and Salamanders jointly conducted a secret plan to prevent the Secessionists from claiming the bounty. They patiently infiltrated the outer system, and then deployed a small elite force covertly into Angstrom 11 before the fulfillment of the bounty, commanded in person by Lord Commander Karab Kuln and Captain Pellas Mirsan of the Salamanders. Angstrom 11 was a lifeless, turbulent volcanic world, on the edge of the Forbidden System where the contract was to be fulfilled. And with the pilots of the Salamanders, who had peerless experience in operating in hostile environments thanks to the nature of their own world of Nocturne, they managed to infiltrate a strike force on the surface of Angstrom 11 and lie undetected in waiting. In short order, the Secessionists arrived in the system, and waiting until the exchange was underway, the Loyalists sprung a swift ambush, sabotaging the starport base and attacking Secessionist vessels as they landed to retrieve the bounty. The battle that followed was brief but furious, conducted in the inferno reaches of the Angstrom surface as the Loyalists sought to inflict as much damage as possible before they were forced to retreat. In the confusion and destruction that followed, the Angstrom Mechanicus, incensed by the outbreak of hostiles in their domain, assaulted both sides, with heavily armored attack columns of Tech Guard and Praetorian battle servitors making landfall on Angstrom 11 within hours of the attack being launched, while Typhon-class hunter-killers attacked the warships of both sides on the planet's orbit, and swiftly drove both Loyalists and Secessionists from the system. This will become known as the Angstrom Incident, and it was only thanks to the intervention of the Terran legates that open war with the Mechanicus forces of Angstrom was avoided, with Lord Commander Karab Kuln dispatching the remaining Firehawks and the Raptorus Rex to blockade the outer system's approaches, as a precautionary measure for the war's duration. 909 and 41. With the vital junctions of Sagan and Viania now in their hands, and the Lamenters out of the war, the Imperium's Loyalists now had effective command of the Maelstrom Zone's major warp routes, enabling them to rapidly move their forces across the region almost at will, while largely denying that ability to their enemy. This factor, combined with the Angstrom incident aftermath, which served to stir up an hornet's nest in the near Maelstrom region, effectively cut the Tyrant's sphere of influence in two and contained the secession. This shift in the balance of power also effectively divided the secessionists between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector itself. Now only the unpredictable forces of the executioners offered a significant threat to the Loyalist control outside of the secessionist enclaves. Of these secessionist-controlled zones, the least dangerous one to the Loyalist cause was the Endymion cluster. Here the surviving Mantis warriors were reduced to fighting a guerrilla resistance against an ongoing Loyalist suppression campaign carried out by elements of the Fire Angels and Sons of Medusa chapters, with sporadic but bloody engagements being fought in the Tranquility, Iblis and Sigurd systems, including one severe defeat for the Loyalist forces when the Fire Angel strike cruiser Polaris Rising was raided by the Mantis warriors under the leadership of the prophetic master librarian Halazra Red, that managed to disable the main plasma reactors of the ship before withdrawing, and left it to be destroyed by two orc kill cruisers. It is then that the Mantis warriors ambushed the orcs, annihilating them. Only 37 Fire Angels Space Marines survived the battle, all wounded in one way or another, but they were given under the care of their apothecary and med servitors, while the Polaris Rising was taken by the Mantis warriors as a prize of war. Only the Badab sector remained resolutely in the Tyrant's hands, comprising the Badab system itself, as well as a number of important and highly fortified systems, most notably Shunna, the Cabalus, and Isin. Strategos Militum analysis indicated that taking these systems would likely be as costly and bloody for the Loyalists as the rest of the war so far combined. Added to this was the unknown quantity of astral claws themselves. Since the revelation that Luft Huron had worked upon his chapter's expansion in secret, it could not be certain just how many Space Marines were deployed in the region's defense, while even the most conservative estimate of the numbers of Tyrant's Legion forces in the area reached well into the millions. Huron had all but abandoned the rest of his once mighty domains by the end of 909 and 41, and whispers reached the ears of Loyalist intelligence operatives of the Tyrant's increasing violence and paranoia, and of the further tightening of his murderous stranglehold on those worlds he still controlled.
I had noticed that he was a megalomaniac even during the Betrayal at Griff from the description. Is he going crazy?
Crazy? Maybe. But drunk with power is for certain by this point. By this point, the Loyalist domination of the Maelstrom Zone's main warp route meant that they also were now able to blockade and to some extent exploit the mineral-rich worlds of the Pale Stars again, denying any substantial access to their resources from the enemy, which when combined with the isolation of Angstrom, greatly reduced the secessionist capacity to create and distribute new war material. In particular, perhaps the most serious vulnerability the secessionists now faced was in space. Thanks to the combination of attrition of the last several years, and most particularly with the destruction or capture of the Lamenters chapter fleet, the secessionists were now much reduced in warships, suffering in particular a shortage of heavy unit and capital ships. The fleet assets the Astral Claws could master were now largely limited to light strike crafts, and a handful of strike cruiser and battle barges accompanied by the ravaged remnants of the once potent Maelstrom squadron. These remaining heavy ships Huron wisely deployed only as a concentrated reserve force based in the Badab system itself, ready to reinforce the line wherever the Loyalist main strike would fall. Perhaps the most unpredictable factor in the Badab war during this period remained the enigmatic and barbarous chapter of the Executioners. Since their arrival in the conflict in 907 and 41, the Executioners had fought their own war, and proved the scourge of Loyalist patrols and supply convoys, as well as destroying numerous outposts and listening stations. They had accounted for the majority of Loyalist seized and destroyed vessels. They also committed themselves to several heavy raids as far as Bellerophon's Fall and Cairo, while some of their heaviest actions fell against the Minotaurs chapter in the southern Maelstrom zone, such as the bloody tank duel they fought on the airless moon of Uzeal in the Crow's World system. The Executioner's base of operations was believed to have been a star system somewhere on the edge of the turbulent Dene stellar drift, but its location remained elusive, allowing the chapter to raid almost at will. The Executioners, however, aside from challenging the Loyalist forces in open warfare and attacking their supply lines, steadfastly refused to operate under the direct control of the Tyrant of Badab, operating only as allies but never as subordinates, a situation that created growing ire within the secessionists' ranks. In the closing days of 909 and 41, the Maelstrom secession was largely contained, but the Loyalist commanders were under no illusion that the war itself was over. What now remained would be an even more brutal phase of operations than any seen before in the conflict, a time of ruthless planetary purges, scorched earth campaigns, and apocalyptic close sieges. For the Loyalist part, many of the chapters that have fought the Imperium's cause have suffered substantial losses, and now will be replaced in the order of battle by other Space Marine chapters of yet darker renown, brought in by Legate Inquisitor Frayne to ensure the Badab sector will be crushed utterly. For those caught up in this clash of godlike warriors and superhuman killers, the bloodiest days of the Badab War were yet to come. One thing is for certain, a singular figure in the battle brothers of his chapter will prove the most dangerous foe of the war. The arrival of his chapter alone would have been a scourge on its own, but his presence on the battlefields would prove the infamous legends about him true. This titanic and brutal warrior will turn battlefields into lakes of blood, with his name echoing for generations in the Maelstrom Zone as one of the most brutal killers the Imperium ever created. But that is a tale for another day.
None leave the slaughterhouse, not alive.
Wow, that was an intricate recalling of the war, don't you think, Pio?
Yeah, but I also lost my hero in Huron, because let's remind everyone, this happened because Huron didn't pay taxes to the Space IRS.
I had told you the road to hell was paved with good intentions. Huron was ambitious, even too much, but wanted in the end just to do what was right. Unfortunately, he became unhinged in his ambition, to the point of turning on the people and empire he was created to protect. There you are! Was it hard to recover him? A dozen blood ravens are not something somebody will notice. Did your cousin help you? Good. Pio, let me introduce you to Joy's cousin, a space marine that serves under the Blood Angels. Meet Black Rage Larry.
That name has very dangerous implications.
Well, Pio, the video is over. Time for you to make the subtitles.
I don't want to do them, nor be chained to a desk with a laptop again and forced to do them.
Larry? Please, convince him to do the subtitles, in your subtle and extremely reasonable way.
Attack!
The story of the Badab War will continue in part 3, The Rise of Huron Blackheart.